The story begins in England at the very start of the 20th century. On June 23, 1894, at White Lodge in Richmond Park, a boy is born, Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David. The eldest son of Prince George, Duke of York, and Duchess Mary, he is destined for an extraordinary fate, one day to inherit the throne of England. Within the family, he is simply called a David, heir, his last given name. His childhood is marked by rigor. King Edward VII, his grandfather, and later George V, his father, embody Victorian tradition, discipline, and distance. David, however, quickly distinguishes himself through his sensitivity and independence. He loves animals, sports, and travel, but above all, he despises convention. His relationship with his parents is cold. The future King George V considers his son frivolous, too emotional, unfit to reign a comer. He places more hope in his second son, Albert, who would later become George VI. David, meanwhile, suffers from a lack of affection that he will spend his life trying to fill. At the Royal Naval College in Osborne and later at Dartmouth, he is not distinguished by his academic success, but fascinates his peers with his charisma. He already possesses that magnetic charm, that modern allure, that blend of confidence and melancholy that will make him one of the most popular princes of his time. At 20, he serves during the First World War. Though prevented from fighting directly, the royal family could not risk the heir's death. He visits the trenches, speaks to soldiers, and earns their respect. This direct contact with the suffering of ordinary men leaves a deep mark on him. The young prince understands the harshness of ordinary life, and his worldview is forever changed. Yet behind the image of the ideal prince, the first cracks appear. David is bored by the constraints of the court. He engages in a series of affairs with married women from London's aristocracy, Freda Dudley Ward, Lady Furness, passionate but impossible relationships. Love and freedom become his obsessions. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, another life is unfolding. Bessie Wallace Warfield is born in 1896 in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania. The only daughter of a father who died shortly after her birth, she grows up in a middle-class Southern American family. Her mother, Alice, raises her alone under modest conditions, yet Wallace shows early signs of a singular ambition. She wants to belong to the elegant, refined world of high society. Gifted with a quick mind and an acute sense of style, she learns to master the manners of the social elite. At 20, she marries a naval officer, Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., a marriage marked by absence and her husband's drinking. The couple divorces in 1927. Wallace then settles in London with her second husband, Ernest Simpson, a cultured, composed Anglo-American businessman. It is in this cosmopolitan London of the Roaring Twenties that the destinies of David and Wallace will cross. In 1931, Lady Furness, a friend of the Prince of Wales, invites Wallace to a dinner in London. There, she meets the prince. Nothing spectacular at first. Wallace is neither particularly beautiful nor impressed by his status. But she possesses what few women at court do: wit, repartee, and a refreshing sense of freedom. Edward, weary of docile courtiers, is instantly fascinated. Friendship becomes intimacy. Soon, she is invited to the prince's private circles, then to Balmoral, then to Sandringham. Rumors spread, yet few imagine the depth of their bond. Wallace becomes his confidant, his support, his balance. She speaks to him without fear, challenges him, advises him. Edward, long accustomed to emotional isolation, finally finds someone who understands him. Gradually, he becomes attached to her with almost obsessive intensity. For him, Wallace becomes indispensable. For her, Edward is a fragile, passionate, yet dangerous man, To love the Prince of Wales is to risk the storm. On January 20th, 1936, King George V dies. The next day, his son David becomes King Edward VIII. At 41 years old, he is handsome, modern, and adored by the public. The newspapers call him the people's king a comer. He represents hope, renewal, the symbol of a monarchy finally in tune with its time. But behind this dazzling image, a storm is brewing. Wallis Simpson, still married to Ernest, now occupies a central place in the life of the new sovereign. She is invited to private dinners, appears at court receptions, and accompanies the king everywhere. Her presence, though discreet at first, becomes impossible to ignore. The royal household, the Church of England, and above all the government begin to panic. For centuries, the monarch has been the head of the Anglican Church. However, the Church forbids remarriage after divorce if the ex-spouse is still alive. Wallis has been divorced once, and her second husband is still alive. Therefore, she cannot become queen. Edward VIII, however, refuses to give up. He tells his advisors that he wants to marry her whatever the cost to comer. The government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, insists that such a marriage is constitutionally impossible. The king, however, remains deaf to reason. Within the palace, whispers grow louder. The courtiers avoid the new queen-to-be. The press, bound by censorship, says nothing, but the rumors cross the Atlantic. In America, the story of the king in love fascinates the public. In Britain, only a few editors dare to mention the scandal discreetly. The crisis worsens in late 1936 when Wallis files for divorce from Ernest Simpson. Everyone now knows what Edward intends to do. The situation becomes untenable. By autumn 1936, the affair has turned into a state crisis. The king is determined to marry Wallis. The government is equally determined to prevent it. Baldwin meets the king several times, urging him to reconsider. But Edward remains unmoved. He proposes an alternative, a morganatic marriage. Wallis would become his wife but not queen. She would not bear the title of Her Majesty. The British government refuses, and so do the Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand. The Commonwealth stands united against the king's desire. For Baldwin, the situation is clear. If the king insists, he will have to abdicate. For Edward, the situation is equally clear. Without Wallis, he refuses to reign. The tension reaches its peak in early December. The press, until then silent, finally breaks the embargo. The people discover the truth. The reaction is divided. Some admire the king's passion, others condemn his irresponsibility. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, publicly condemns the idea of such a marriage. He appeals to the moral conscience of the nation. The British establishment closes ranks. Edward becomes isolated. December 10th, 1936. At Fort Belvedere, his private residence, Edward signs the instrument of abdication. His three brothers, the Duke of York, the Duke of Gloucester, and the Duke of Kent, sign as witnesses. The next day, December 11th, at 10 p.m., Edward VIII speaks on the radio. His voice trembles slightly, but remains calm. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king without the help and support of the woman I love. This sentence, broadcast throughout the empire, becomes historic. A king renounces his crown for love. His brother Albert becomes King George VI. The monarchy survives the crisis. Edward, now Duke of Windsor, prepares to leave the country. Wallis, still in France, hears the speech on the radio. She bursts into tears. She had not wanted him to abdicate. She had even begged him to reconsider. But the decision was made. The King of Love had chosen exile on December 12, 1936. The Duke of Windsor leaves England. He sails from Portsmouth aboard a destroyer to France. The crowds are silent, respectful, moved. The man who could have been king has given up everything for love. In France, he is reunited with Wallis. The two meet discreetly at the Château d'Arcand in Tours. There, away from the cameras, they begin a new life, free, yet excluded from everything that had defined him. Their wedding takes place on June 3, 1937, a modest ceremony, celebrated by a clergyman sympathetic to their cause. No member of the royal family attends. Wallis becomes the Duchess of Windsor, but she will never be accepted as Her Royal Highness a comer. For her, it is a wound that will never truly heal. The couple settles between France and the United States. They travel, visit friends, and slowly create a circle of loyal supporters. But behind appearances, bitterness grows. Edward feels humiliated by the refusal of his family to recognize his wife. Wallis, meanwhile, realizes that her love has cost him everything. Their relationship, though sincere, begins to carry the weight of sacrifice. When World War II breaks out in 1939, the Windsors are living in France. The situation quickly becomes delicate. Edward, as former king, still enjoys influence. However, his attitude during the pre-war years raises suspicion. In 1937, he had visited Germany and met Adolf Hitler. Officially, the visit was diplomatic, but it created scandal. Photographs show the couple giving the Nazi salute, a gesture interpreted around the world as political sympathy. Historians have since debated the extent of Edward's views. He admired Germany's recovery from the Depression and feared communism, but these impressions would later haunt his legacy. When the German army invades France in 1940, the Windsors flee to Spain, then Portugal. British intelligence monitors them closely. Some fear that the Nazis might attempt to use them for propaganda. Documents later reveal that Hitler had considered kidnapping the couple to set up a puppet monarchy. In Europe, Prime Minister Winston Churchill appoints Edward governor of the Bahamas, a distant, safe post in the Caribbean. For the Duke, it is a humiliation, a gilded exile. For Wallis, it is another beginning, far from Europe's intrigues. The Windsors arrive in Nassau in August 1940. The island is beautiful, but isolated. The Duke takes his role seriously, attempting to improve local conditions. Yet he never manages to escape suspicion. London distrusts him, Washington observes him, and the press continues to speculate. When the war ends in 1945, the Windsors return to France. They settle in Paris, at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement, in a luxurious villa lent by a wealthy friend. Their life there will become legendary. The couple live surrounded by art, fashion, and diplomacy. Wallis becomes an icon of elegance, wearing creations by Dior and Givenchy. Edward, meanwhile, writes his memoirs, published under the title A King's Story. The book provides his version of events, dignified, romantic, and subtly critical of the establishment. Although they are invited to some royal events abroad, their relationship with the British royal family remains strained. Edward is never fully reconciled with his brother George VI, nor later with Queen Elizabeth II. When they occasionally visit England, protocol remains cold. The Duchess is still excluded from official ceremonies. The past remains unforgiven. Their life in Paris is a mixture of luxury and melancholy. They host receptions, attend galas, meet celebrities and aristocrats. But behind the glitter, time passes. Edward grows old. Wallis protects him from solitude. They have no children, only each other. Their union, born of rebellion, becomes one of loyalty and endurance. In 1945, after 6 years in the Bahamas, Edward and Wallis return to France. They settle in a townhouse in Paris, then purchase a house both in Paris and in Provence, leading a cosmopolitan life. The couple becomes an emblem of exiled aristocracy, hosting grand parties, traveling regularly to New York, London, or the French Riviera. Edward, now the Duke of Windsor, sometimes attempts to regain a measure of influence, but remains officially retired. He writes, travels, receives guests, and keeps a keen interest in hunting and luxury automobiles. Wallis embodies elegance and modernity. Her wardrobe inspires generations, and her name becomes synonymous with sophistication. Yet she remains cautious with Parisian high society, knowing she will always be seen as an outsider, the American woman who once shook the British monarchy. Their life, though surrounded by glamour, is not without tension. Edward, frustrated by his diminished role, sometimes grows irritable. Wallis, aware that they will never be fully accepted by the royal family, develops quiet resilience. The couple finds balance in luxury, travel, and mutual companionship. Even in exile, the couple remains under constant observation. Photographers and journalists follow their every move. Their trips are scrutinized, their appearances analyzed, every gesture interpreted. Edward's past correspondence with political figures, including pre-war contacts in Germany, continues to spark controversy. Historians debate whether his earliest sympathies had gone too far, though no proof shows that he acted against Britain's interests. Wallis, meanwhile, faces her own battles with public perception. To the tabloids, she remains the calculating woman who stole a king. In reality, her life is far more complex, a mix of determination, intelligence, and a fierce will to survive in a world that never truly forgave her. Despite gossip and slander, she remains unwaveringly loyal to Edward. Their marriage, though often misunderstood, endures through decades, until death. By the 1960s, Edward gradually withdraws from public life. He suffers from health problems, particularly heart issues, worsened by years of stress and smoking. He still receives guests, corresponds with old friends, and remains attentive to world events. His relations with his family soften slightly, though formal distance persists. When Queen Elizabeth II visits him in Paris in 1972, it is a discreet yet symbolic gesture of reconciliation. A few weeks later, on May 28, 1972, Edward VIII dies in Paris, aged 77. His body is returned to England, where he is buried at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle. Wallis, now widowed, attends the funeral, dressed entirely in black, composed, and silent. For her, it is the end of a long, complex love story, a chapter closed with dignity. After Edward's death, Wallis continues to live in their Paris home. Her days become quieter, marked by solitude and memories. The once vibrant Duchess now withdraws from public life. She preserves her routines, reads, listens to music, and occasionally receives visitors. Her health slowly declines, and she begins to suffer from ailments that limit her mobility. Yet she remains elegant to the end, her spirit sharp, her pride intact. She rarely speaks publicly about her life, refusing sensational interviews. She knows that history has already judged her. What matters to her now is peace, and the memory of the man who gave up a crown for her. On April 24, 1986, Wallis Simpson dies in Paris at the age of 89. Her body is laid to rest beside her husband's at Frogmore, together again, side by side, after half a century of love, exile, and defiance.